My name is Jennifer Herline, Executive Director of the French Heritage Society, speaking to you from New York. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the fourth talk in Russell Kelley's new series, The Great Churches of Paris, the evolution of the church and ecclesiastical architecture in Paris from the Middle Ages to today. Following the success of the Grands Châteaux of the Loire and Ile-de-France and the Making of the French Garden series of online talks, Russell Kelley spent the summer visiting the most beautiful churches of Paris. And now he shares what he has learned about another important pillar of France's cultural and architectural heritage, the extraordinary variety of churches that were built in every commune in France, but especially in Paris, over the past 1,000 years. Today, we will learn about the neoclassical churches of before and after the Revolution, which changed everything, with the Panthéon a shining example. But before we get started, I will share a few words about French Heritage Society. We're an American nonprofit organization with 10 chapters in the United States and 1 in Paris. Our grant giving supports the preservation of culturally and historically significant French architecture in France and in the United States. Our education program selects and sends French and American university students across the Atlantic for internships at esteemed institutions. We're so pleased to be a part of this series that highlights an important part of French heritage. This series is possible thanks to the Alliance Française de Chicago and the Alliance Française de Miami Metro, and the support of their communications partners, the Association of American Women in Europe, the Federation of Alliance Française US, and the Fondation pour la Sauvegarde de l'Art Français. A few words about Russell. Russell Kelley is the curator and moderator of the past 2 winter Zoom lecture series on the Grands Châteaux of the Loire and Ile-de-France and the Making of the French Garden. He has lived in Paris for 30 years and is the author of The Making of Paris, the story of how Paris evolved from a fishing village into the world's most beautiful city. What more is there to say? À vous, Russell.
Merci, Jennifer, and welcome everyone. Last week, we explored the wars of religion and the dramatic impact that they had on church building. These wars that pitted the Catholics versus the Huguenots caused untold damage on churches in Paris and retarded the construction, delayed the construction of Renaissance churches. And they only came rushing back in the 17th century with really the construction of Baroque churches, which is where we left off last week. And this week, we will talk about what I call the war against religion, not of religions, but against religion, which is one of the key aspects of the revolution that swept France. And its impact on church building was absolutely devastating. So off to this is the 4th lecture in our series, the neoclassical churches of before and after the Revolution. We will go from the Baroque churches, illustrated by the Val de Grace here, to the neoclassical churches.
Also, just to mention, we don't see your screen yet.
Oh my. Whoops. Let me start again. Okay. Okay. So the 4th lecture in our series here. Where we go from the Baroque churches exemplified by the Val de Grace to the neoclassical churches exemplified by the La Madeleine. Big change. The neoclassical style, which really featured only in the 70-year period, a fairly brief period in church building, 1760 to 1830. And it is characterized by columns, porticos, pediments of antiquity with its geometric forms and the details from the Greek and Roman periods monumental domes, or flat roofs. We will examine 4 neoclassical churches in Paris, one from before the Revolution, the Panthéon, which started as a church, and then 3 from after the Revolution, the Madeleine, which did not start as a church, the Expiatory Chapel, and Notre-Dame de Lorette. The first one started as the Église Saint-Geneviève, built by the architect Soufflot. And it was constructed during the reigns of Louis XV and XVI, on top of the Montagne Sainte-Geneviève, which was the highest point on the left bank, so a privileged location for a church. Louis XV decided to build this church to replace the old church of the Abbey of Sainte-Geneviève. It took quite a while to get momentum going. Jacques Germain Soufflot went through 5 different designs from 1755 to 1779, and it was only finished literally when the revolution broke out in 1790. Soufflot's first design in 1755, clearly you see the Greek cross here with the porch or portico in front of it. And his final design of the facade shows a portico with 6 Corinthian columns topped by a pediment, and on top a huge monumental dome. These are all classic features of the neoclassical style of architecture, which was inspired in the case of the Panthéon by the Panthéon in Rome. There are actually on the Panthéon 3 different domes, one within the other, and unusually they are all of stone. Earlier domes in Paris had wooden supports inside. This is quite high, particularly since it's the highest, built on the highest point of the left bank and the highest point of Paris, until Paris was enlarged in 1860 with the addition of, among other places, Montmartre. So now Sacré-Cœur is even higher. But its dome is not the highest by far in Europe. St. Peter's Basilica has that distinction in the Vatican City in Rome. This is a view looking up at the one of the domes from the center part, and you can see this extremely luxurious decoration on the inside with these rounded arches and concave shapes everywhere, voluptuous architecture. The interior was redecorated with murals. The murals that you see there were built only in the 19th century. And as a shout out to Allison, iron rods were used to give greater strength and stability to this stone structure, this enormous stone structure. As mentioned, this was to replace the Abbey Church, and that's the arrow to the left points to the Abbey Church of the Saint-Geneviève Abbey. Both the church and the entire Abbey buildings, the arrow to the right, were demolished only in 1802. Under the reign of Louis XVI, under the reign of Louis XVI, the church was finished in 1790. Louis XVI, of course, had married Marie Antoinette when they were both extremely young. Louis supported the American Revolutionary War, and largely thanks to that support, America defeated England. But at the same time, Louis bankrupted France. In his General Lafayette went to the United States to fight in the revolution, and he also went back after the revolution. And when he returned to Paris, he talked to Versailles, he talked to Louis XVI, and he was extremely impressed by what an extraordinary contribution French Huguenots had made to the American Revolution. Turns out that Washington himself was a descendant of French Huguenots, as was Paul Revere. So Lafayette encouraged Louis XVI to grant legal and civil rights to Protestants and Jews, which he did in the Edict of Tolerance of 1787. Perhaps a high point for toleration of religion in the 18th century. Because of the parlous financial situation that France found itself in, Louis XVI and his government decided that they needed to reform the tax system to raise more taxes at the national level, which required approval from the Estates General. So he convened the Estates General in Versailles on May 5th, 1789. What are the Estates General, les États Généraux? It's a consultative and legislative assembly of the three estates, which meant classes. First estate, the clergy; the second, nobility; the third, commoners. It was only called occasionally. It was not a sitting institution at all, and it had not met since 1614. And when the estates voted, each one had a vote. The first estate and the second estate could outvote the third estate. And as a result, the third estate was considered, as this cartoon shows, to be carrying the weight of the first two estates, the clergy and the nobility. And the caption at the bottom of this illustration says, "You should hope that this game will be over soon." And soon over it was, with the holding of the Estates General in Versailles in May 1789. First estate consisted of 330 delegates elected from the clergy. Overall, in France, there are about 100,000 Catholic clergy, but the church was an extremely large landowner, the largest single landowner in France. The second estate consisted of 291 nobles who had been elected by their peers, but the total nobility represented 400,000 men and women, and they owned 25% of the land. And the third estate was, of course, the commoners, which represented 98% of the population of 25 million. In a negotiation with the king, the third estate had convinced him to increase the number of delegates representing the third estate, essentially doubling it, so that now there were more members of the third estate represented than there were in the first and second estate, and more delegates. So the next step was for the third estate to say, we should not vote by class, but rather by delegate, and therefore give majority control to the commoners. This the king refused to do. And as a result, the third estate broke off from the Estates General to create its own meeting in the tennis court, actually, in Versailles. And they were joined ultimately by a majority of the clergy from the first estate and by 47 of the 291 nobles in the second estate, who were known as the ci-devant. And this group created the National Assembly in June. One of the ci-devant was Talleyrand, who was a very young bishop of Autun, age 35, known as the Diable Boiteux, the limping devil, because he was such a shrewd and clever fellow who ended up being a diplomat in the regimes of, believe it or not, Louis XVI and during the Revolution, but he got out before the Terror, during the Napoleonic period, but he got out before Waterloo. And then he managed to get back in the good favors of the Restoration governments of Louis XVIII and his brother Charles VIII and their successor, Louis Philippe, an extraordinary person who's depicted in this illustration as speaking out of 6 mouths: Vive le roi, vive la révolution, etc. He attended the first estate, the Estates General in Versailles, representing the first estate. Then he quickly shifted to the National Assembly as a ci-devant, which meant kind of beforehand. Before he was a member of the first estate, but now he's a member participating in the National Assembly. And he, even as a former member of the first estate, the clergy, he promoted the appropriation of church property and the civil constitution of the clergy, which I will talk about in a moment, whereby the clergymen had to swear allegiance to the civil government, not to the Pope. For that, Talleyrand was excommunicated by Pius VI, and he ended up resigning as bishop that same year, 1791. Another ci-devant who represented the second estate was Louis-Philippe, the Duc d'Orléans, who was the cousin of Louis XVI. And he changed his name to Philippe Égalité, Philip Equality, and totally got on board with the revolution's ideals of first a constitutional monarchy, but ultimately ended up voting for the death of his cousin Louis XVI, and ultimately himself was guillotined during the Terror. The main leader at the beginning of the estates of the National Assembly was another former member of the First Estate, the Comte de Mirabeau, and he was elected president of the National Assembly and supported the constitutional monarchy, which existed for the first few years. So despite the fact that the taking of the Bastille occurred only weeks after the creation of the National Assembly, it was a fairly moderate start to the revolution because the king remained king, but now in the context of a constitutional monarchy. On the side of the church, things didn't look so bad at first, with the Declaration of Rights of Man, the Man and the Citizen, coming out in August, partly drafted by Talleyrand, which included in Article 12 the freedom of religion. But it was a very brief period of freedom of religion, because then began what I call the war against religion, which was characterized by the so-called de-Christianization of France between 1789 and 1801, which entailed the confiscation of all churches and monasteries throughout France and the persecution of priests, Catholic priests, and any other priests throughout France. So in 1790, the National Assembly confiscated all church lands and property and adopted the civil constitution of the clergy, whereby the clergy had to swear allegiance to the secular government and not to the Pope. What happened after these churches were confiscated? Well, we'll go through several of them to show you. So the Église Saint-Geneviève that had just been completed in 1790 was converted into a temple of the nation, where the great men of the nation and the revolution would be buried. Its windows were bricked up in 1795 because they wanted to make it darker and more solemn for that purpose of being a temple of the nation. This is an image showing the transfer of Voltaire, the famous Enlightenment philosopher, his remains to the Panthéon in 1791. But he wasn't the first to be interred there. Actually, Mirabeau, the Comte de Mirabeau, the first president of the National Assembly, was interred there in 1791. But he was removed in 1794 when it turned out that he was actually in the employ of, or at least communicating with the king while he was representing the National Assembly. So as a result of that, the new rule was put in force that no one who died could be buried in the Pantheon for 10 years after, until at least 10 years had passed after his death. And then there was a to and fro. So we think of the Pantheon as being converted to the great mausoleum of the men of France in 1791. Not at all. During the Napoleonic period, it was converted back to a church, at least the first empire of the Napoleonic period, to a church on the ground floor and the Pantheon in the crypt. And then during the revolution, the restoration, it went back to being just a church. But then in the July monarchy of Louis Philippe, it be back to being a temple of glory. Then under Napoleon III, back to being a church. And then finally, only in 1881, did it definitively become the Pantheon that we know today. So just going back a little bit, the original sculpture on the pediment was of a religious nature, but it was replaced by the current sculpture showing statesmen and scholars on the left and soldiers to the right, a much more secular theme dedicated to the great men, the grateful homeland. 81 people are interred in the crypt. I'm just going to mention, these are the famous names that come up of the 81, and I'll just talk about one, Victor Hugo, because he was he had such an incredible reception there. And he marked the following period that we'll talk about next week. I'm just going to quickly review his life because he was such a character in the 19th century France. Published Notre Dame de Paris in 1831, got into politics and was a deputy in the Second Republic. Went into exile when Napoleon had his coup and took control. Hugo was a total Republican. It was in exile that he published Les Miserables. And it was only after the departure, the deposal of Napoleon III that Victor Hugo returned to Paris, where he was elected deputy to the new National Assembly and senator, before finally dying in 1885, when he was buried in the Pantheon. Before his burial, his coffin was displayed on top of this structure called a catafalque under the Arc de Triomphe. And it was accompanied by 2 million people down the Champs-Élysées, all the way to his burial in the Pantheon. Other churches met different fates during the revolution. This is a church that was on the Ile-de-la-Cité that was demolished, and in its place stands now the Tribunal de Commerce, right opposite the Conciergerie. The Église Saint-Joseph-des-Carmes, which we talked about last week because it was one of the first churches in Paris with a dome, was transformed into a prison in August of 1792. And the following month, on September 2nd, it is where 114 priests réfractaires were massacred as part of a 5-day massacre of priests in France. Réfractaires because they refused to swear allegiance to the civil constitution of the clergy. Notre Dame became a temple of reason. Saint-Sulpice first became a temple of reason, and then the reason was replaced by the supreme being, another secular religion promoted by Robespierre. And then when that was over, it became a temple to victory before finally being restored to the cult in 1801. The Église Saint-Jacques de la Boucherie, which had been built by the Butchers Guild near the Les Halles, was demolished, except for the tower, which we all know as the Tour Saint-Jacques. And there is the Couvent des Châteaux, which third arrow at the bottom points to. And the top two point to the Palais de Luxembourg. The north is at the top, and its lovely garden behind it. But the Couvent, the buildings of the Couvent convent were demolished, and all those fields in green there around it were added to the Jardin de Luxembourg. And you can see now the esplanade that goes all the way from the top of that arrow there to the bottom on the right photo. All of that was added, as were the buildings on either side, which originally were part of the grounds of the convent and were built upon by Haussmann. The Église Saint-Germain-des-Prés was used to store gunpowder. All of the land around it was sold. All of the abbey buildings were demolished. The only ones that remain were the church, the abbot's palace, and the third arrow points to the stables. All of that was flattened and developed, and subdivided and developed. The abbot's palace is still on the Rue de l'Abbé, which was only built in 1800. It's been cleaned up since this photo. It looks beautiful. It now houses the Institut Catholique. The Place von Fürstenberg, the charming Place von Fürstenberg, replaced the stables of the abbot. And it's retained the exact same shape as the area of the stables, the square where the stables were located. So of the vast Abbaye Saint-Germain-des-Prés, all that is left is the church and the abbey, the abbot's palace, with the construction of the Rue de l'Abbé next to it, the creation of the Place von Fürstenberg, the continuation of the Rue Bonaparte all the way to the new Boulevard Saint-Germain, built by Haussmann. And this is what we see today from the Boulevard Saint-Germain. Another great monastery was the Saint-Martin-des-Champs. Its walls were demolished, and it was used as a prison during the Revolution. But it is the one monastery in Paris that still more or less retains the look and feel of a monastery, because it has been preserved now as the National Conservatory of Arts and Trades, more or less occupying the same footprint. And the arrow points to the chapel. This is looking south, so you can see the Louvre at the top right. CNAM is the Conservatoire National des Arts et Métiers, with its chapel, which has been spruced up and now houses part of the museum. This is the main entrance on the Rue Saint-Martin. The former chapel of the Couvent des Petits Augustins was converted into the Musée des Monuments Français, Museum of French Monuments, where bits and pieces of French monuments and churches that were being destroyed during the Revolution were recovered by Alexandre Lenoir and preserved there. The portal, actually, remarkable portal, is not from the church, the chapel, but was actually taken from the Château d'Anet and installed by Alexandre Lenoir. The Château d'Anet was the last residence of Diane de Poitiers. And this chapel now resides in the courtyard of the École des Beaux-Arts. The arrow pointing to it. The École des Beaux-Arts is just off of on the left bank of the Seine. So while the revolution got off to a fairly moderate start, it took a couple of serious turns towards violence. And the first turn was the creation of the First Republic on September 21st, 1792, where the monarchy ended. The king was removed from his role as king, the end of the Ancien Régime, and the First Republic was established We are now in France on the Fifth Republic. The convention was replaced the National Assembly, and the radical Jacobins took power from the moderate Girondins. And the executions began with Louis the 16th himself and his wife, and the establishment of the Executive Committee of Public Safety. Shortly thereafter, the Reign of Terror began. It was at the First Republic to which we owe the slogan Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. It did go on to say, ou la mort at that time, and there was plenty of death at the time of the creation of the French Republic. Louis XVI was executed on the Place de la Révolution, which had previously been known as the Place Louis XV, his predecessor, his father, Louis XV, but was renamed the Place de la Révolution. His wife followed him 10 months later. Before they were killed, they were kept prisoner in the tower of the temple, which was another monastery next to the Saint-Martin-des-Champs that we just looked at. The tower was demolished by Napoleon because he wanted to get rid of this. It could have been an homage or a pilgrimage point for the monarchy. This is the enclos du temple, the temple enclosure, and the tower with the arrow. None of it exists today. We'll find out more about what happened next week. That's where it's located in Paris, not far from Saint-Martin-des-Champs. Robespierre was elected to the Committee of Public Safety in July 1793, and that was the beginning of the terror. As just one small illustration of how the revolution went after the church, they removed the calendar because, of course, the Gregorian calendar, had religious background in it, and replaced it with the revolutionary calendar. Priest réfractaires, those who refused to swear loyalty to the civil constitution, were executed. The iconoclasm, the destruction of all images of, in this case, royalty and the church took place. And the Catholic Church was replaced by the secular religion, the cult of reason. Churches were turned into, many of them, temples of reason. Later, temples of reason and the cult of reason was replaced by Robespierre's idea, the cult of the supreme being. The commune, which is the name of the government of the city of Paris during the revolution, ordered the destruction of the 28 statues at Notre Dame Cathedral, thinking that they were the kings of France, which they were not. The heads of the kings of Judah who were beheaded were actually recovered in 1977, and many of them are now on display in the Musée de Cluny, Museum of the Middle Ages. But it wasn't just statues that were decapitated. Heaven knows, the Place de la Révolution killed nearly 1,200 victims between January 93 and June 1794. So 17 months period, over nearly 1,200, over 1,100 victims there. Things reached a peak in the terror with the Festival of the Supreme Being, intended to replace Catholicism and the cult of reason as a state religion. And then it exploded on the Place du Trône Renversé, when in less than only 1 month, more people were guillotined than had been guillotined on the Place de la Révolution the previous year and a half. 1,300 people, including 16 Carmelite nuns, were decapitated, and the victims were buried in 2 common graves known in French as a fosse commune at the Picpus Cemetery, 35 rue de Picpus. The Place de la Nation in East Paris is the former Place du Trône, which was renamed during the Revolution, the Place of the Throne, because that's where Louis XIV was welcomed into France with his wife, Anne d'Autriche. Is that right? No, Marie-Thérèse. Sorry, his mother was Anne d'Autriche. And it was called the Place du, renamed the Place du Trône Renversé, the place of the overturned throne during the Revolution. And number 35 points to where the graves, the common graves were for the victims of these decapitations, not far from the site. After the Revolution, as you, after the during the Restoration, actually the graves, the chapel was built, and relatives of the royalty, the aristocrats who had been decapitated there were allowed to be buried in the same graveyard. And Lafayette had lost his mother and I believe wife, so he qualified and he is buried there. And the American ambassador puts a wreath on his grave every year on the 4th of July. Finally, it was too much, and Robespierre himself fell victim to the guillotine, which had been moved back to the Place de la Révolution for the occasion. And we enter the third and final phase of the revolution, which saw the Committee of Public Safety replaced by the Directory, which reestablished some measure of freedom of worship, but still remained anti-clerical. In 1799, the consulate replaced the Directory by a coup d'etat, with Napoleon becoming the first consul at the tender age of 30 and formally ending the age of the revolution and starting the Napoleonic age. Napoleon was a general, made an incredibly young general, 24, and then became first consul at age 30. And at age, after his, as first consul, he met with the Pope, Pius, and agreed the Concordat of 1801, concluding that Catholicism was the religion of the great majority of the French, but it wasn't the state religion. It was one of the religions of the French. So other religions were allowed to practice. The state retained the power to nominate bishops and pay the clergy, and the church relinquished any claim to the confiscated lands. So the church's lands remained owned by the state, even if the Catholic Church was allowed to practice mass in them, hold mass in them thereafter. And this Concordat of 1801 remained in effect until 1904. Napoleon declared the empire, the first empire, which replaced the first republic. And he became the emperor of the French at the tender age of 35. And he wanted to make Paris into a new Rome. He looks rather Roman here. He crowned himself emperor at Notre Dame while Pope Pius looked on. That gives you an idea that there had been some rapprochement with the church, but it really was the beginning. Instead of a de-Christianization of France, it was a secular, 100 years of off and on secularization and separation of church and state in France. So now the revolution's over. We get back to the churches. This is the Place Louis XV, which is where now the Place de la Révolution and then the Place de la Concorde, which was designed by Jacques Gabriel for Louis XV. And you can see the arrow points to a church that was originally envisioned to be built where the Madeleine is. but it was actually started by Napoleon in 1807 as a temple to the glory of the great army, a monument to the glory of the great army. And it was only after he was deposed and the restoration occurred that it was converted to a church, the Église de la Madeleine. It was inspired by the Maison Carrée in Nîmes, which is in remarkable condition, and you can see just what an inspiration it was for the La Madeleine. The La Madeleine was only consecrated in 1842, the architect Pierre-Alexandre Vignon. Interestingly, it has no windows, much like the Panthéon, which actually did have windows at one time before they were bricked up, but it does have 3 light wells. And you can see very similar architecture to the Panthéon with these vast round arches, coffers in the friezes and columns, pillars inside the church. Napoleon, as I said, wanted to convert Paris into a new Rome. So he had built directly opposite the Madeleine was the Palais Bourbon on the other side of the Place de la Concorde and the bridge de la Concorde. So in order to complement the portico on the La Madeleine, he had a similar portico constructed on the Palais Bourbon. And he carried on with that theme with the Bourse de Paris, also looking a lot like a Roman temple. The Napoleonic period ended with Waterloo, and the Bourbon Restoration occurred with the arrival of Louis XVI's next brother, Louis XVIII. Louis XVII was one of the sons of Louis XVI, who died in the tower that we talked about, the Tower of the Temple, as a young boy. And Louis XVIII wanted to pay homage to his cousin, his older brother Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette, who were buried in the Madeleine Cemetery, which is about as far away from the Place de la Révolution as the Pius Cemetery was from the Place du Trône Renversé. In it were buried the bodies of the 100 Swiss guards who were massacred in the Tuileries Gardens defending Louis XVI in August 1792, as well as Louis and Marie Antoinette, and hundreds of other victims. And Louis XVIII built these small chapels to commemorate the victims of the guillotining who had been buried there, but he particularly built what is known as the Chapelle Expiatoire, the expiatory chapel, to commemorate Louis XVI and his wife, designed by Pierre-François Léonard Fontaine in the neoclassical style. Once again, you see these concave shapes on the interior, the domes, the walls are not necessarily flat, and these large, round, voluptuous, once again, arches. Louis XVIII was, after he died, he was succeeded by his brother Charles X. And largely during his reign, the Église Notre-Dame de Lorette was constructed. It's actually started just before his reign, and it ended after his reign. The architect was Louis Hippolyte Lebas, who is perhaps most closely associated with the neoclassical architecture in Paris. As you can see, it's got the typical columns, the portico, the pediment, and on top are 3 statues for hope, faith, hope, and charity. This is looking at the portico from a street away, or more, 2 streets away, looking north, looking up the Rue Lafitte towards Montmartre, towards Sacré-Cœur. And it was located in what is the new quarter called La Nouvelle Athènes, the New Athens, which was populated in the 1930s, 1830s by artists, musicians, and many creative types, and making it the birthplace of French Romanticism. The inside is quite remarkable of this church because it's got a flat ceiling, which is coffered, elaborately coffered ceiling. Triumphal arch separates the nave from the choir, and paintings cover its walls. The coffered ceilings, pillars, huge side aisles. It's interesting, they're much wider than normal, equal to half the width of the nave, with columns of marble on either side of the side aisles. The upper walls elaborately decorated, again, with the friezes and the paintings. The choir with a cupola, which is painted, which is quite unusual. The Notre-Dame de Lorette is located between the Opéra Garnier and Montmartre, which in the trendy, now it's known as Sopi, the South Pigalle neighborhood of the 9th arrondissement. The 19th century was had a lot of revolutions. Following the primary revolution that we talked about at the beginning, there were 3 more revolutions, and we will cover all of them next week. The first one, just to mention briefly, the Trois Glorieuses, the 3 days, July 27th, 28th, and 29th of 1830, led to the overthrow of the conservative government of Charles X and the arrival, after the taking of the Hôtel de Ville, of Louis-Philippe as a constitutional monarch once again. He was the son of Philippe Égalité that we talked about at the very beginning. He had many nicknames. He was known as the King of the French, not of France, the bourgeois king, because he was trying to find some place in between. He was looking for the juste milieu in between the Ancien Regime and the bourgeois, and the citizen, also known as the Citizen King. And I will also give him another name, which is the Restorer of Churches, which we will talk about next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Russell. If you have questions that you would like Russell to address during our time together, we have about 15 minutes, so I encourage you to please place them in either the chat function or there's the Q&A function, and he'd be happy to answer them. I see one up here, Russell, which is sort of taking us back to basics, if you will. What was the population of Paris during the Revolution?
Well, Paris, let me back up. In 1700, Paris was the largest city in Europe. In 1800, it had been surpassed by London. And the population of London in 1800 was 1 million. And the population of Paris was about half that, 500,000. Another little interesting factoid that I picked up, it was the first time that a city in Paris, in Europe, reached a population, London, reached a population of 1 million since Rome in about 200 AD, which is pretty impressive when you think about the Roman Empire and Rome. But anyway, the short answer is around 500,000 people. But you also have to remember that Paris kept on changing its borders, for example, next week we will briefly mention that in 1860 it doubled in size. So in surface area, literally twice as many square kilometers in Paris or meters in Paris. So just by that virtue alone, their population went up a lot in 1860 without really changing the inner center's population.
And how many churches were destroyed in Paris during the Revolution?
Well, I don't have any really firm numbers on that, but I've heard, I mean, the number of churches in Paris was ridiculous. Of course, every parish had a church, and there were lots and lots of parishes, and there were many chapels, and then there were many monasteries with abbey churches as well. So I've heard a number thrown around that there were 300 churches in Paris. And at the end of the Revolution, there were about 100. So 2/3 would have been demolished, either then or shortly thereafter the Revolution. And those that were not demolished were very seriously damaged because they'd been used to store saltpeter and other things that were really not good for their churches, for the churches. So when I went over the list of what happened to the churches, it is really this whole thing, why I say the Revolution changed everything. There used to be all sorts of monasteries with not only churches, but lots of lands, and that all disappeared. And all of that land was later subdivided and built on. And so that's largely, it was a question of, and a lot of that happened after the Revolution. And I do have a statistic, which I just read somewhere. 22 churches and 51 convents were destroyed by developers between 1800 and 1814.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
And Lynn asked a slightly related question, I suppose. What happened to the clergy during the Revolution, those that pledged allegiance to the state and therefore avoided death?
Well, it was there was every variety of things that happened. A lot, a good number swore allegiance, and therefore were allowed to continue to be clergy members. They were on the payroll of the state now, and they did what the state told them to do. Some, the réfractaires, refused to swear allegiance, and some of them paid for that with their lives. A lot of them, you saw the 114 who were slaughtered in the church, and there were many others throughout France who were slaughtered. But they kept a low profile, though, to say the least. The clergy kept a low profile, and many left. You know, they went into exile. So you had those kind of three options: swear allegiance, do it, and keep a low profile, and hopefully come back later, which happened. Stick to your guns at the risk of your life, and many people did that. And those poor Carmelite nuns who refused to swear allegiance were guillotined as a result, and those who went into exile.
Okay. And how were the churches able to spring back into being after the Revolution? In other words, how was their restoration supported?
There was fairly, a lot of the people were not revolutionary, or at least when it came to getting rid of the church. So it's quite interesting to see what happened with Prussia, who they closed down that was another communist atheistic regime. And in 1817, I think they closed all the churches, and they opened them only, in 1990, whenever it was. So they'd been closed for 70 years, but there was a real demand, and it came back very quickly, remarkably quickly. In Paris, in France, they'd only been closed for 10 years. So there was still a lot of religious people out there who were happy to go back to church when they were available. so the religion, came back, but the anti-clerical element was closely associated with republicanism. And the first republic was 1792. And there were other republics that were, and we're now on our fifth, but particularly the first, second, third, all of them were closely associated with anti-clericalism. So people were allowed to come back, but the church started to, or the state started to separate itself from the state. And what we'll talk about next week is the physical churches, the restoration of the churches. And that didn't happen until the 1840s. So basically starting in 1790, the churches went through 50 years of depredation and neglect and fell into terrible states of repair. Some of them couldn't be repaired, but others, thankfully, were repaired, starting in the regime of Louis Philippe.
Thank you. And Michael asks, what does coffered mean?
So it's kind of boxes, like a coffer, a box. So if you look at a ceiling, it's recessed in it are nice little, perfectly, they're usually rectangular shapes that recede into the ceiling, giving it an interesting kind of it's a decorative style.
Thank you. And then a question from Mia, who says she missed the beginning of the last lecture as well as this one, but she'd like to know if the Basilica of Notre Dame de Victoire in the second arrondissement has any particular architectural significance.
I'll have to look that one up. Notre Dame de Victoire in the second arrondissement.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that
asking the right person.
Yeah, I don't know if it's in here. I don't know the quick answer that I can give you off the top of my head. I have
We can always follow up afterwards. It's a good question. Thank you. There's a question here that I like. It is from Anne, who says, you talked about a monuments museum in Paris. Is there still one in Paris or in France?
Well, the one that I mentioned, set up by Lenoir to house all these bits and pieces from chateaux and churches and so on, was closed in 1860 when the restoration occurred because Louis XVI or 18th ordered all those remnants to be sent back to their original owners. So it was closed. So there's no there. And interestingly, if you go around Paris in many parks, small parks and so on, you will see remnants of stonework and so on. So if, for example, next to the Saint-Germain-des-Prés, there's just to the left of it, looking at the facade, the main facade, is a little park. And in it, there are bits and pieces of masonry from some of the buildings that had been demolished in the Abbey area during the Revolution. Mm-hmm. And you'll find those kinds of elements in lots of gardens around Paris. So, behind the Hotel de Sully, for example, in the Marais, there's a very interesting window or the tracing, the metal, the stone tracery of a stained glass window from some church, maybe the Église Saint-Louis or nearby. I'm not sure. But in terms of a single repository of that sort of thing, not at the moment, but there was a proposal made last summer to convert part of the Hôtel Dieu, which is right next to Notre Dame, to a church, to a museum where they would, of churches of France, not just Paris, where they would keep just those sorts of remnants. So have a place to, instead of having them dispersed all around, to have a little bit more order in all of that. And I think that's a brilliant idea. We'll see if it gets any traction.
Yes, we will. I will also say that when I was in Paris last month, I went to there's Notre Dame exhibition at the Cité de l'Architecture et du Patrimoine. It was quite good, quite interesting. Again, it's just one specific temporary exhibition, but nevertheless.
Yeah, but that's a great place to go. Wonderful museum.
And let's see, we'll have a couple more questions here, and then we'll have to close it down. But this is from Scott, who asked, during the convention of churches, were religious elements such as crucifixes, tabernacles, reliquaries, paintings, stained glass, etc., removed and preserved, or were they typically destroyed and later replaced with new pieces?
Everything, all church property was confiscated. Not the building, not just the buildings, not just the land, everything in the buildings was confiscated. So there would be, it depends on the church. There would be those where perhaps parishioners or clergy protected the reliquaries, but many of them, they lost them forever, and they had to rebuild after the restoration occurred. Many of, for example, Notre Dame, itself, which we'll talk about a little bit in 2 weeks. We'll give kind of an example of one church where they did preserve the relics, but not in the church.
And then I think this last question is a good one for us to end on. And it is from Christopher, who asks, have you ever considered doing a series on Paris cemeteries?
No, I have to say I haven't, but it's an interesting subject, and I did write an article about them, at least. So is it in my book? I've forgotten. But yeah, cemeteries are a fascinating subject. I can tell you that they all started in the Cimetière des Innocents, which is where the Les Halles is now located. And there were some church yards around, but the main cemetery in Paris was the center, was in the Cimetière des Innocents. And it got so damn full, it started to overflow into people's basements. So it was under Napoleon that they actually emptied the cemetery, and they put all the bones in the catacombs, famously, arranging them artfully in various geometric shape or artistic shapes. And they built the big cemeteries that we know today, that kind of around the city, Montmartre, Père Lachaise, the Montparnasse, and there's one on the 16th as well, until those filled up, and then they started getting more land in suburbs. So I don't think I'm going to do a series on that, but it is an interesting subject.
Maybe a one-off around Halloween or something.
Yeah, there's a good idea.
Well, I'd like to thank all of you for being with us today. Russell, I'd like to especially thank you for this wonderful program, for this wonderful series. And we will see you next week, Thursday, February 9th, for the Restoration Movement and the Eclectic Churches of the 19th Century at 12 noon in Chicago, 1 p.m. for those of us on the East Coast, and 7 p.m. for those in France. Thank you again.
Thank you, Jennifer.